Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for our Missouri Trailblazers program on Hazelle Hedges Rollins, brought to you by the Missouri State Museum. My name is Lauren Williams, and I'm the Adult and Community Services Manager at the Columbia Public Library. Before I turn things over to the Missouri State Museum for today's presentation, I just have a few of the usual housekeeping items for Zoom. On your Zoom screen, if you hover or tap, you should see a raise hand icon and a chat bubble icon. Everyone's microphones are currently muted, but if you'd like to ask a question at the end of the presentation, you can click that raise hand icon and I can unmute you to ask your question. Or if you'd rather just type your question in the chat, you can ask your question that way at any time during the presentation, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the program. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available on the museum's Facebook page and the library's YouTube channel after it has been edited. And if you are watching with a group, you've got more than one person with you at home, go ahead and put that in the chat for us and let us know that. So today's program is a continuation of our Missouri Trailblazers series featuring trailblazers who have impacted Missouri. I would like to say a very special thank you to the Missouri State Museum for their partnership in organizing these presentations, and we've got some fun things planned for next year as well, so stay tuned for that. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to welcome Carrie Hammond, Chief Museum Interpreter and Senior Site Specialist for Missouri State Museum and Jefferson Landing Historic Site. Carrie, you want to let us know what's about to go on at the museum before our program starts?
Thank you, Lauren. So we're coming into the winter season. Great time to visit the museum.
Oh, you got muted again, Carrie.
Sorry. Okay. We have numerous new exhibits to browse, and the museum is open every day except for major observed holidays. Our Jefferson Landing State Historic Site will be closing for the season December 2nd and will reopen March of 2023. But you can still attend our Landing After Hours programs the first Wednesday of every month. These will be both in person at the Landing and live streamed on the museum's Facebook page. Thank you for adding that link to the chat. The next Landing After Hours program is mine, and I will be featuring granny women, yarb doctors, and other Missouri folk healers. So we hope to see some of you there in person or for the live stream. All right, we're ready for you, Angela.
Thanks, Carrie. We appreciate it. So this afternoon, we're welcoming back Angela Wells, and Angela is the education specialist at the Missouri State Museum in Jefferson City. Her current role is in museum education. However, Angela has worked in the field of public history for the last 5 years in both museum and archive spaces, and she is currently a graduate student of public history at Missouri State University. Her research is focused on the stories of empire and natural history collections and decolonizing museum collections. As an advocate for integrating local history in the classroom, Angela believes in the power of public history spaces to aid in cultivating curiosity, community, and empathy. In addition to her interest in interpreting the past, she is a mother who enjoys natural history, illustration, writing, reading, coffee, and frugal traveling. So welcome, Angela. Thanks for being here with us to talk to us about Hazelle Hedges Rollins.
Sorry, Lauren, I don't remember writing such a wordy, wow, I will be sure to cut that down next time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Okay, and please let me know, thumbs up, Lauren. Okay, thank you. All right, and just out of curiosity, can you see my mouse on the screen? You can, okay. I was going to use it as a tool, so I was wondering about that. But welcome, everyone. And thank you for joining me virtually today for my presentation on the Missouri puppeteer, entrepreneur, and trailblazer, Hazelle Hedges Rollins. As Lauren had mentioned, my name is Angela, and my professional work is in museum education for the State Museum. However, I thought I would actually start by sharing why it is I'm giving this presentation today, or rather what initially drew me to this project topic. Personally, my interest in puppets stems from my 90s upbringing, particularly through weekend PBS children's television programs, which I'm sure a lot of other 90s kids can relate to as well. Some examples: Lamb Chops, Play Along, and Sesame Street, of course, and then parts of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood involved puppets as well. And please feel free to share in the chat, how you were first introduced to the art of puppetry, because I think it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm curious how many of you actually saw live puppet shows versus being introduced to puppetry through television and movies like I was. I actually did not see a live puppet show until I was an adult. So, and as a kid, I especially looked forward to watching Lamb Chop, which starred the fabulous Sherry Lewis, if everyone remembers. She was probably the first puppeteer and ventriloquist that I came to know and be familiar with through the silver screen. And these were all, of course, wholesome kids shows, but I'm also of the early Goosebumps generation. So I was introduced to puppets in the horror genre as well. So I grew up with this sort of mixed view of puppets, which is why I was excited to take on this research project of a Missouri woman puppeteer, which is, of course, unique in itself, but also just the history of puppetry in general drew me to this project. Okay, so just briefly going over the presentation agenda for today. First, I wanted to start by introducing Hazelle. Some of you listening may have never heard of her before. I certainly hadn't before I started researching her for this presentation. So I want to briefly go over some of her more significant accomplishments and explain, why she's considered a Missouri trailblazer today. Then I want to dive into the world history of puppetry. Now, I think in order to better understand Hazelle's interests and her career, we need to first understand sort of where the art of puppetry originated, and how it eventually made its way all the way to the state of Missouri. So finally, we're going to look at Hazelle's earlier life. How did she get into the business of puppet making and sort of what is her legacy today? So I'll kind of seek to answer those questions a little bit later on in the presentation. Okay, so who was Hazelle? Who is Hazelle Hedges Rollins? She remains in legacy Missouri trailblazer for ignoring the obstacle of being a woman in a predominantly male business world, like so many other women had to of her generation. She's unique, though, in that she took an entrepreneurial risk by entering the already saturated toy industry. And I think of an even more of a risk is of all the things she could choose to produce, she chose puppets, more specifically string puppets, referred to as marionettes. But I wanted to highlight here some of her remarkable accomplishments as a woman, a puppeteer, and an entrepreneur, because she really went on to do some incredible things locally in the Kansas City area. So as you can see here, she was the founder of Puppeteers of America. She was the first of a very short list of women appointed in the United States to serve as chair of the Kansas City Advisory Council of the U.S. Small Business Administration. She became at one point the director of the Women's Chamber of Commerce, and she was even appointed by the Kansas City Mayor, H. Roe Bartle, to the Women's Commission for International Relations and Trade. So I think what you see here by this sort of highlights of her accomplishments is that she was without a doubt an entrepreneurial success. She was a successful businesswoman. But these are just a few of her selected accomplishments. A bit later on in this presentation, I'm going to go into greater detail on how Hazelle came to be a puppeteer, who paved her own way to this entrepreneurial success that you see here. In other words, we're going to kind of dive into her origin story. So first, however, to better understand how Hazelle was introduced to the world of puppetry, I want to briefly go over the world history of puppets and puppetry, and by doing so, also examine these different kinds of puppets and take a look at the significance of marionettes, which will come to play an important part in Missouri's puppetry history, which I'll talk about later on. Okay, so first I'm going to ask the most basic question: what is a puppet? And while this may seem like a very simple question to you all, it's actually proven to be more complicated than one might imagine. For example, just this past week, this question actually got brought up in a discussion with a coworker of mine on whether or not Big Bird from Sesame Street is in fact a puppet. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the show and with Jim Henson's Muppets. Big Bird is, of course, big, right? So my coworker felt that because a person was technically inside the Big Bird costume, that this made the character not an actual puppet. Long story short, Big Bird is definitely a puppet, albeit a larger than human puppet. And so I've included this illustration just because I thought it was kind of interesting. But the puppeteer is inside of the Big Bird puppet. Their eyes are pretty much level with Big Bird's chest, and then they extend their hand above their head and use their hand to manipulate Big Bird's mouth and his head. So it's just kind of a different way of puppeteering. Here's a little nightmare fuel for you. No. So here's another example of a unique form of puppeteering, which, and so this is with the Czech filmmaker Jan Svankmajer, which I might be saying his name wrong, so I apologize if I am. But these are images from his stop motion production of Alice in Wonderland, in which he manipulated objects such as dolls, and as you can see here, even bones as puppets. And so while I was doing my research, watching Svankmajer's film actually radically challenged my notion of what I thought a puppet could be. So I think what this shows is that a puppet can take many different forms, and that a puppeteer is truly an artist in how they create and they manipulate and they control their puppets. So to sum it up, puppetry is, in my definition, a tangible art. The physical puppet in itself is a work of art. The puppet maker is the artist. Puppet shows are put on by performance artists or puppeteers, but there's always this sort of tangible and textured element to puppetry. And so Hazelle, like all puppeteers, was an artist. And the reason she became such a successful businesswoman or entrepreneur later on is because of her talent and because of her passion for this unique art form. Okay, I'm gonna snag a drink here real quick. Okay, so where did puppets come from? Where did they originate? Well, this is actually a question still debated among historians today, which I'm not going to seek to answer in this presentation, to be honest. That'll be a different presentation, different day. However, I will show you some of the earliest known puppets from around the world. One of the main theories is that puppetry originates in India. However, the puppet historian Henryk Jerkowski, and he kind of wrote the leading text on European puppet history, he argued that while a certain amount did in fact come out of India, its origins actually had to be independent because of the nature of puppetry. Because essentially anyone could have picked up an object and started manipulating it, right? So with the earliest puppet artifacts, it's difficult to differentiate between whether these would have been dolls or actual puppets. It's thought to believe that puppetry shares an aspect of its origins with dolls. There's obvious differences between puppets and dolls, of course. However, there's also very obvious similarities between dolls and puppets. And just in the previous slide that I showed you, we saw an image of a doll being used as a puppet. So obviously there is a connection between the two. I want to just very briefly go over some of the different kinds of puppetry. Pictured here is a shadow puppet. And so if you visited Java in Indonesia today, you could see one of these shadow puppet performances, which have been known to last for up to 8 hours in length, I read. Yeah, it's quite lengthy. But these shows have been presented for purely entertainment purposes, but also for religious purposes as well, to tell old Hindu religious stories. The Japanese have a style called bunraku, where usually there are 3 people connected to one puppet, and one person just moves the head, another person moves the torso and the foot, and so on. But this style is very disciplined, so disciplined that to get from entry level of doing the bottom part of the body up to the head takes about 25 years to master. That's how complex these puppets are to move. And as you can see in this image, the two puppeteers' faces are covered. Once they have mastered being a puppeteer, their face will no longer be required to be covered during the performances. So it's important to note here that puppetry from Southeast Asia would eventually go on to influence European puppetry. In the European Middle Ages, we see this same connection of puppet shows used to tell religious narratives. And what's interesting about in Europe, though, is that these shows were actually performed in a church. So this did not last, as I'm sure you can imagine, because certain morality plays had certain characters take on comic dimensions. So this led to this situation in the late Middle Ages where people are in church watching puppet shows and laughing at crude characters. Obviously, this would not stand. So they were eventually forced out of the church and into the streets. And this is where we see puppeteers become street performers. And the theater, as we know it, kind of takes off. These wandering street performers lived these humble lives, sort of taking their shows around Europe. From Italy, we see the spreading of the commedia dell'arte, which was an improvised kind of popular comedy where traveling puppeteers adapted their comic dialogue and action according to just a few basic plots using stock characters. So this is where we see the rise of Punchinello, whose name was later shortened to Mr. Punch. Some of you are probably familiar with the famous Punch and Judy performances. Punch is this crude buffoon of a character. The story and characterization of these shows mostly stayed the same throughout Europe, and then the same eventually when they came to North America as well. But the story it's pretty straightforward. I mean, Punch mishandles the baby. Punch and Judy quarrel and fight. Punch typically kills Judy. A policeman comes and Punch beats him up. Punch has a run-in with a variety of other figures. He beats him up until eventually he faces his final foe, which is usually the devil. And so a proper Punch and Judy show is going to require all of these basic plot elements to it. Obviously, these are very violent and wildly inappropriate shows, which would not transfer well today. However, by 1825, Punch was at the height of its fame. So that's when these shows were really, really popular. And so in the 19th century, the puppet show was taken to America by immigrants from many European countries. And their various national traditions sort of laid the foundations for the great variety of styles that are found here today. Oh, I had to include the worm from the labyrinth. So I actually watched the labyrinth recently with my youngest son and it scared him. We couldn't finish it. But I absolutely love this character from the labyrinth, so I had to include him somehow in this presentation. But through the 18th and the 19th centuries, various European forms of puppetry arrived in North America. So we see the marionette string puppet, and the marionette companies would come by ship to these coastal communities, towns, and cities. And then the European style shadow puppets and the glove puppets, those all came to North America in the late 18th century. So American puppetry is really unique. Its many styles and techniques combine ancient and immigrant traditions, homegrown innovations, and then also we later on see the influence of electronic media in puppetry as well. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I was introduced to the art of puppetry through children's television programs and movies. It's the same with my own children. Every year we watch the Muppets Christmas Carol together. It's sort of our tradition and they look forward to it every winter. Tim Burton, who I forgot to include a picture of his work on the slide, but he's actually another film creator who I was familiar with as a child who used puppets in some of his films as well. And so whether or not you care for the use of puppets as a tool to scare, we cannot deny as Americans that puppets have effectively left their mark in the American horror genre. We just cannot deny this. Puppets can be used to tell all kinds of stories, including scary ones. I was a 90s kid, like I had mentioned, who stayed up late reading R.L. Stine's Night of the Living Dummy, being scared by Slappy the ventriloquist dummy. So, and then those of the 80s might recall the Puppet Master films, and then the early thousands generation is probably familiar with the puppet from the Saw franchise, which I never saw, but I know it's very popular. So they have left their mark in the American horror genre. So I was, of course, a kid who enjoyed watching puppets in films and television for entertainment. However, what really piqued my interest in researching the history of puppetry actually came about a few years ago when I first learned about Yiddish puppet theater in America. And so Yiddish puppet theater is sort of this fusion of traditional Jewish folklore, modern politics, and then satire. Historically, puppets weren't a common form of entertainment in Jewish culture, but in the mid-1920s, puppetry had become popular in American theater, thanks to master puppet makers like the famed puppeteer Tony Sarg, who I'm actually going to talk about in just a little bit, who Hazelle trained under. So puppets began to appear on stages in New York and throughout the country. In New York City, for the first time, puppets spoke Yiddish on a Yiddish theater stage, which I think serves as an excellent example of how unique and how varied American puppetry really is. Now that brings us finally to puppetry in Missouri. So Missouri is also unique when it comes to the art form, because for some 40 years, it served as the largest exclusive manufacturer of marionettes and puppets in the world. This was even outweighing manufacturers in Europe for a time. So who does Missouri have to credit for this impressive entrepreneurial endeavor but Hazelle Hedges Rollins? Hazelle was born in 1910 and she grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. She was the oldest of 5 children with 4 younger brothers. In the summer of 1932, when Hazelle was only 22 years of age, a chain of events would start to shape a future in puppetry for her. When 11-year-old Donald Newman, her next door neighbor, brought her a marionette manufactured in Italy, and he asked her to make a companion so that he could put on a puppet show. The term marionette is used in English specifically for string puppets to be distinguished from the French marionette, which is sort of this generic term for all types of puppets. But marionettes have a long, sometimes distinguished history. And it was actually in 1738, we find the first record in the US of an English style marionette show taking place, which was the Adventures of Harlequin and Scaramouche by a puppeteer named Holt. So this style of puppetry had been in the US long before the 1930s. Was this Hazelle's first encounter with a marionette puppet? I'm honestly not sure. But either way, this moment in Hazelle's life left an influential spark. And she was, of course, happy to help her young neighbor with this project. Hazelle was a naturally crafty person, and people knew this about her. So it was not an unusual thing for him to ask for her help on a project like this. She graduated with a BFA, a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and taught arts and crafts classes to unemployed women at the local YWCA. And she just had this natural talent and a strong passion for the visual arts. Her first job out of college was at then a newly opened museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. That was her first job out of college. And she actually started as a telephone operator. However, the museum staff caught on that she had talent, and they actually asked her to teach puppet making on Tuesdays and on Thursdays to more than 100 students, and the ages were roughly 7 to 15. So she started working with children on making these puppets, the children that were enrolled in the museum's summer program. But Hazelle was anxious to start her own puppet business, which she did in the Hedges family basement during the Great Depression in 1935. Her sort of first big entrepreneurial move was that she took her marionettes to the 1935 New York Toy Fair. And she was looking for real retailers who would be interested in selling her puppets. The only factories at that time which made puppets exclusively were in France, Italy, Germany, and I think Czechoslovakia. I think those were the only factories at the time that made puppets exclusively. So she was kind of charting this untouched territory in US puppet production. Okay. It was during her time in Greenwich Village that Hazelle became inspired by Tony Sarg, who was teaching a workshop there while Hazelle happened to be there. So Sarg was a German-American puppeteer and a children's book illustrator. And he was famous for his puppets, but also famous for his giant Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloons. That's kind of what he really became known for. But he's often credited with reviving the American puppet show from his work. Inspired by Sarg's legacy, Hazelle then returned to take her talents out of her parents' basement and establish her own small factory in the Kansas City garment district, where she actually employed Kansas City Art Institute students to make simple, lightweight, short-stringed marionettes with heads of sawdust and clay composite. Is how they were first made. Hazelle proved to be quite successful with this. Her first local sales were to Emery Bird Thayer Company. That was her first local sales. And then her first national sales was at Marshall Field in Chicago. And then the orders increased. Hazelle's puppets were shipped from Kansas City to New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Hazelle entered the international market in 1936 and sold a fourth of its annual puppet production overseas. So that's just a year after she started her puppetry business. She's selling these internationally. And so, by this next year, Hazelle was selling more puppets in Johannesburg and South Africa than she was in Kansas City at that time, which is truly remarkable as an entrepreneur. Okay. In the late 1940s and 1950s, TV shows like the wildly popular Howdy Doody show spurred the puppet business. So by 1957, annual puppet sales had spiked or had climbed to over 250,000 puppets. And at that time, Hazelle employed as many as 50 workers, which is pretty substantial for a puppetry business, I should say. And she sold to over 1,800 department and toy stores. So very successful. She also kept her puppets in the public eye by participating in community events. Her booth at the Plaza Art Fair attracted attention from young and old alike, with music and dancing, which she did with her Popeye marionettes. Of all of her marionettes, Tito, a white-faced clown wearing his red jumpsuit with white polka dots, became Hazelle's best seller. And so I just wanted to show a picture here because it's really cool. You see sort of the packaging that he would have came in. And so this would have been her most popular one, the one that would have been shipped out the most probably. So he even had sort of this known name of Tito the puppet. So Hazelle will, of course, be remembered as a successful entrepreneur and puppeteer, but she also socially impacted the local Kansas City community when schools started using puppets as therapy tools. And this actually reached out nationwide as well. But after Hazelle developed simple finger puppets in the 1960s, New York City even, schools ordered more than 10,000 to actually help children act out conflicts they faced in racially troubled school situations. And so I included this quote here because I just think it's an awesome quote. But Hazelle says, "Puppets are more than toys. They are widely used in teaching and audiovisual education in the primary grades and in speech classes. Puppets inspire children," educators say, "inspire them to create with action." And so I thought that was just a nice quote from Hazelle. Hazelle Incorporated, her business, was sold in 1975 when the Rollinses retired. So it lived, for her, it was a successful business throughout her working life. And actually, it continued for a few years to operate under different ownership through 1983. When the Kansas City Puppet Factory closed in 1983, the remaining inventory of Hazelle's puppets and the puppet parts were given to Goodwill Industries. And then in the early 1990s, Goodwill actually donated the items to the Greater Kansas City Puppetry Guild. Hazelle donated her private collection of over 1,000 ethnic and folk puppets, which she acquired over 40 years' time, to several institutions. So the Smithsonian Institution, the Museum of Anthropology at the University of Kansas, the Nelson Atkins, of course, the Kansas City Museum, and then the Fowler Museum of Cultural History at UCLA. They all have Hazelle puppets in their collections. The Smithsonian holds, I think, some 60 Hazelle puppets, which they call Hazelle Famous Puppets. If you go on their website and look at their collections, you can see images of her puppets there. And they've also been on exhibit over the years as well. But pictured here from the Smithsonian collections is a pair of marionettes dressed like pilgrims. This is one I found from their website in their virtual or digital collections. So these puppets premiered in 1949 on a Kansas City, Missouri television station, KCTV. And Hazelle used this pair of marionettes for several years for Thanksgiving programs that featured the art of puppetry. So these two puppets in particular were commonly used by Hazelle herself. Hazelle died on March 25th, 1984, but her legacy lives on through the Puppetry Arts Institute, which is located in Independence, Missouri. And in fact, they do such a fantastic job that I don't think this program would have been possible for me to give without the rare resources that they provided me. I visited them about a year ago. Well, yeah, exactly a year ago, November 2021. I visited them, and that's where I got a lot of the pictures in my presentation from of Hazelle's puppets. And they actually even gifted the Missouri State Museum this incredible book on Hazelle's life that I was able to use for this program research. So they're doing really incredible things over there. I have nothing but nice things to say about them. But it's been open to the public since 2001. Today, the nonprofit offers Kansas Cityans an opportunity to take puppet workshops and enjoy professional puppet shows. They also explore Jackson County's rich local history as well. Some 300 Hazelle puppet designs are exhibited at the Puppetry Arts Institute Museum. And the Institute subcommittee gives workshops and puppet presentations. And they also ensure the Hazelle puppets and puppet parts are professionally curated and preserved there. Continuing on Hazelle's work with the local schools as well. Today, Independence School District kindergartners come to and visit the Puppetry Arts Institute to learn the basics about cooperation, sharing, and sort of following the rules through making and using Hazelle's puppets. So it's really pretty cool. They get to come and create their own puppet there. So really a neat experience and opportunities that they offer. And then I included this slide because I just wanted to point out that puppetry is still relevant today. It's still being done, still a very popular art form. This picture in particular was taken from the New York Times, and it's of two Parisian puppeteers during COVID. And the article was kind of focused on how puppeteering boomed during COVID. Like it brought people a lot of comfort, I guess, and a lot of people picked up this art form. So in a way, it's kind of getting more and more popular from what I've seen. I've also, this past summer, I create take-home packets for kids where they can come to the museum and pick them up. And I did one on shadow puppets, and that proved to be really popular, where kids could create their own shadow puppets. And then last month, with a coworker of mine, we did a Halloween program involving shadow theater as well. And that was the highlight of the program. So I think it just goes without saying that kids love puppets, people love puppets. They're very popular still today. And just pointing out a couple of the main sources that I use throughout my presentation. So again, the Puppetry Arts Institute, an invaluable resource. They were so helpful when I went and visited them. And I attended one of their History of American Puppetry programs. But again, that book, Hazelle and Her Marionettes by Mike Jolly, that was my main resource for this presentation. But then also David Curell, I think is maybe how you say his name. He's written a lot of books on puppets. And so I used him as a resource as well, the Puppets and Puppet Theater and the Making and Manipulating Marionettes, which really go in depth on how to create puppets and put on a puppet show. But there's also large sections on puppet history as well, which is what I use to reference. And so that really brings me to the end of my presentation, but I am happy to take any questions that you all might have.
Thanks, Angela. So yeah, if you have questions, type them in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you so that you can ask those questions. But I will go ahead and get started. I'm curious what initially made you interested in researching Hazelle's career and the history of puppetry. How did you get going on this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with Hazelle specifically, I jumped at the opportunity when I found out there was a woman puppeteer from the state of Missouri that I could research and talk about. Actually, Carrie was supposed to do this program, and I said, Carrie, give me this program. And so she did. And so that was wonderful. And I'm very happy I was able to give this presentation because I had so much fun researching her life and just the history of puppetry. It really kind of made me nostalgic and brought me back to my own childhood. And it made me realize how many puppets were in my childhood, because I kind of watched those and didn't really think I was watching puppetry. It was just kind of like watching a film and a television show, but you don't really realize how many puppets were in television shows. And Jim Henson, obviously, big impact on my life. So from those movies and television shows. But puppetry in general, I became interested with it through political puppetry. I thought that was a fascinating aspect when studying World War II specifically.
So that brings me to a question that I had is what do you think it is about puppets that lend them to being used in that way for satire or political criticism or things like that? What it is about the form that lends itself to that?
That's a fascinating question. I think it has to do with how tangible puppets are. So like there's a puppeteer behind them, but they're like controlling them, and something about seeing this art form, seeing these puppets come to life, there's just this very tangible element to it, which I think is captivating, honestly. We see screens all day, we see movies. It's relatively flat in comparison if you think about it, but then we have, these puppeteers coming out and they're really doing this sort of performance, but not of their own face. I don't know, something about it. I think it just draws people in and it makes you want to watch.
I also wonder if there's that element of like you have the performer, but there's a distance between the performer and the puppet, and so that maybe the puppet can get away with saying things or doing things that just a person making the same commentary wouldn't be able to. I don't know. Oh
yeah, I think that's definitely true, especially, and the Punch and Judy is a kind of a horrible but a good example of that, because it was the quintessential, the Englishman you don't want to be is basically what Punch was, and so presenting that to the public, definitely the puppeteer himself would not want to have been seen as Punch.
Yes. Here's another question. What was something that surprised you in your research? And do you have a favorite puppet of Hazelle's?
Oh, Um, I guess what I was surprised about was, well, one, I was surprised she chose puppets. That initially surprised me. Because to be a woman, obviously, in that time going into the business world, you have your own obstacles, but then you're also choosing this, product that's not guaranteed success or anything. So it was really her passion behind it that spearheaded that. But also her travels, like she was really committed to learning about the art of puppetry. She was truly an artist, Hazelle was. And so, she made a point to travel to New York City and to meet these puppeteers and to really, really learn this craft. And so I loved learning that about her, because I started knowing nothing about Hazelle, and then just came everything I kept learning. I'm like, she gets better and better. And then what she did with the schools and teaching lessons through puppets. And I loved how involved she was with the local community, but also nationally, trying to get puppets out in the world. As far as a favorite puppet, I don't have a picture of it, but I did come across this, and it is her Robin Hood puppet, but you could probably look it up. I mean, it's how it sounds. It's Robin Hood, but I just loved the characters from the story. And so seeing all those puppets together I just love that story. So it's neat.
It just occurred to me as you're talking about puppets being used in education and so on. I mean, we use puppets in story time here at the library all of the time. It's a staple
Yes.
in teaching kids about early literacy and bringing stories to life. So yeah, they're part of our daily lives here at the library too. I hadn't thought about that. That's really cool.
I know. That's the funny thing, is like, you kind of don't realize how puppets are around you.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't realize they're puppets. I don't know. It's strange.
That's true. So people are interested in learning more about puppetry in Missouri. Where can they go? How can they do further research?
Definitely the Puppetry Institute, which I've talked quite a bit about. That will be your first stop, is going to see them, because they are obviously very much focused on Hazelle, but they're also focused on the history of puppetry in the United States in general. So it's a really good starting off point too. Well, actually, I would say puppetry in the world. That's where I got those pictures from, the shadow puppets from Indonesia. So, I mean, if you just want to learn about puppetry in general, that's your starting point in Missouri, not having to drive too far. And then I would also look for traveling exhibits, because you can get books, and books are wonderful. I love books. But when you're learning about puppets, it's really fun to see puppets and see exhibits on them and things like that. Because again, it's that sort of tangible element to it. And so I know the Grand Rapids Art Museum has this phenomenal Jim Henson exhibit right now, which I wanted to go to so bad. I was in Michigan last month. It didn't work out. But that will likely be aspects of that will likely be traveling. So just like keeping your eyes open for, those traveling puppet exhibits, or checking out your local museums, things like that.
We had a comment in the chat. One of our attendees said, when I saw this in the coming events in the Jefferson City paper, it took me back to my Cub Scout days. We used 4 and 5 string marionettes in productions.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
That's super cool.
Marionettes too. That's really cool.
Yeah. Very cool.
I feel like hand puppet or like sock puppets or finger puppets would be more common, but using marionettes, that is really, really cool.
That is. I think about those folktale animal puppets that are very popular, and with some really like clever ways you can manipulate them and things. So yeah, there are puppets everywhere.
Oh my gosh. And it's such an art being able to manipulate a marionette too. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't have any other questions. Anyone else in our audience have any questions or comments? Well, this has been fascinating. Angela, thank you so much for sharing this research with us. And I'm now, of course, I'm just thinking about the Lion King musical and how they've created, huge puppets.
Right.
And I'm going to be just looking for puppets everywhere now, I think.
They're everywhere.
So, yeah. All right. We'll all keep our eyes out for puppets. We have another Trailblazers event coming up in December. I want to remind people, and it is going to be about put the link in the chat here, Modern Missouri Masters of Fiction, and this is going to be about Daniel Woodrell and Evan Connell. So those 2 writers will be the focus of that event, and that'll be on the third Tuesday of the month. That's December the 20th at 1:00 on Zoom. And so join us for that. And as always, we really, really appreciate you sharing your time and all of your research with us, Angela. And we thanks the Missouri State Museum for partnering with us for this program. And we'll see you all next month. Have a great rest of your day.